Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take history's most critical turning points and slow them down to find the seconds that truly changed everything.
Today, we are analyzing what is, I think, the ultimate near miss in American financial history.
Mm.
It's helpful to think of history itself as a massive dam.
Okay.
The water rising behind it represents decades of pressure. The political tensions, the technological changes, all the economic grievances
And that water can just sit there, right, building pressure for years and years.
for a very long time.
Hmm.
But the crack in the concrete that finally bursts the dam and changes the entire
So
landscape
that happens in an instant.
in seconds. For this deep dive, the pressure was the devastating financial contagion known as the Panic of 1907.
It started with a failed stock corner in October, and, it quickly threatened to bankrupt the entire rapidly expanding American economy.
And the crack in the dam, that singular moment of coercion that stopped the collapse, it was a locked door.
A locked door in a private Manhattan library. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does.
That's right. Our mission today is to explore the tense, terrifying all-night hours of Saturday, November 10th, 1907. This is the moment when the fate of the entire U.S. financial system, and frankly the stability of the industrial world, was saved.
And not by the Treasury in Washington.
No, not by the government, but by one private citizen, J.P. Morgan. He literally held the nation's financial leaders hostage in his opulent library until they agreed to a massive bailout.
It's just a profound story of systemic fragility confronted by the iron will of an individual. And the fact that we have the Federal Reserve today is a direct consequence of that single, desperate night.
To guide you through this incredible moment, we've structured our deep dive into 4 critical phases. First, we'll examine the immense financial pressure, a nation without any kind of financial safety net, and how a risky copper gamble acted as the spark.
Then second, we'll go inside that room, the East Room of Morgan's library, for the fulcrum moment. We're talking about the dramatic 7-hour, all-night standoff where the entire concept of American credit was on the line.
Third, we will analyze the powerful flood of consequences, the terrifying national realization that led directly to major congressional action and ultimately to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913.
And finally, we'll reflect on what we're calling the fragility thesis. Why this near miss should change the way you view the stability of every major system in the modern world.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's unpack the pressure picker that was 1907.
We begin with the rising water. The paradox of the United States in 1907 is so striking. You have America as this industrial giant. Steel production is soaring, skyscrapers are going up, railroads are connecting the continent. The economic output was just massive.
And yet, its financial architecture was disastrously flawed.
Completely.
It sounds like having the most powerful engine in the world, but you're driving it with no brakes or steering wheel. What exactly was the critical fault line? Why was the economy so strong, yet the system holding it together so weak?
The weakness was structural and institutional. It boils down to one thing: the complete absence of a central bank.
So no safety net.
No institutional safety net, no financial fire department,
Mm.
and crucially, the currency supply was rigid. Or, to use the technical term, it was inelastic.
Okay, that's a concept we need to fully explore. When we talk about an inelastic currency, what does that mean practically for a banker who's watching a panic unfold in front of him?
It means the amount of cash in the system couldn't expand when demand for that cash skyrocketed. This was a direct consequence of the National Banking Act from the Civil War era. The amount of currency was tied to the amount of government bonds a bank held.
So it was fixed.
It was very restricted. It made it impossible for banks to inject liquidity, cash quickly into the system.
So if a bank run starts when everyone suddenly panics and wants to pull their money out in cash, the banks couldn't just draw on a central source or print more money to meet that demand.
Nope. They had to rely on whatever cash reserves they physically held in their vaults.
Wow.
And that's what turns a local problem into a national contagion. If a panic started in New York, the New York banks would hoard their cash. They had to.
To protect themselves.
Of course. So they couldn't send cash reserves to help out banks in Chicago or San Francisco because they needed every last dollar to survive the run in their own city. The panic became self-fulfilling.
And I imagine that just drives up the cost of borrowing money for everyone else, right?
Exactly. The demand for cash forced interest rates, the cost of borrowing to skyrocket. We're talking rates jumping to 100% or more overnight.
100%.
Which of course kills business investment and just deepens the crisis even further. Fear was the ultimate virus, and the system was basically designed to amplify its spread.
And the primary breeding ground for that virus, it seems, was the unregulated trust companies. These just sound harmless, but they were the systemic weakness hiding in plain sight.
They were the darlings of the wealthy, kind of the hedge funds of their day. Trust companies offered higher interest rates than the traditional national banks, which attracted enormous deposits.
And they were heavily involved in the stock market.
Oh, absolutely. But here's the key. They operated with far less regulation, especially concerning their reserves, the amount of cash they had to keep on hand.
Give us the numbers on that. How big was the risk compared to a normal bank?
It was dramatic. I mean, it's night and day. While national banks were required by law to hold reserves of around 25% of their deposits in cash.
Okay, so a quarter of their money had to be ready for withdrawal.
Right. Trust companies, on the other hand, often held as little as 5%, sometimes even less.
5%, that's nothing.
It's walking a tightrope. They were lending out money incredibly aggressively, often for high-risk ventures like margin lending in the stock market. And the growth was off the charts. Their assets had swelled by an incredible 244% in the decade leading up to 1907.
244%.
You have this rapid, unchecked growth. It meant the whole financial system was top-heavy, standing on this very small, very fragile foundation of actual cash reserves.
So you've got this huge, fragile ecosystem of trusts just waiting for a spark. And that spark, funnily enough, wasn't some geopolitical crisis. It was just pure, audacious, speculative failure.
Yes, the catalyst. We're talking about the scheme hatched by F. Augustus Heinz, known as the Copper King, and his associate Charles W. Morse. Heinz was this flamboyant figure, immensely rich and just determined to be richer.
And they decided they were going to corner the market on the stock of the United Copper Company. We hear about cornering markets, but it sounds like something out of a movie plot. What were they actually trying to do?
It's a high-stakes, ruthless game.
Yeah.
They bought massive amounts of the company's stock, believing they had secured the majority of all available shares.
Okay.
They then waited for short sellers, those are the investors who had bet the stock would fall, to be forced to buy the stock from them at an exorbitant price to cover their positions. They intended to squeeze the market for millions.
But they messed up. They miscalculated how much stock was actually out there.
They did. And the whole scheme collapsed spectacularly on October 16, 1907.
How fast did it collapse?
Instantly. When the market realized Heinz and Morse didn't actually control enough shares to execute the squeeze, the stock just plummeted. It was a private financial disaster for them.
But it became a public catastrophe. Why? Because Heinz wasn't just some rich speculator.
That's the crucial connection. He wasn't just a copper magnate. He was also heavily involved in several New York banks and trust companies. He was a banker.
So the failure of the Copper King meant instant failure for the institutions tied to him. The sources say the public didn't distinguish between Heinz the speculator and Heinz the banker.
And why would they? That's the key psychological element of a panic. Confidence, which is everything in banking, just vanished overnight. The thinking was, if Heinz is ruined, then the institutions he controls or is associated with must also be ruined.
It instantly anchored those banks to failure.
Exactly.
And the contagion found its most high-profile victim, the Knickerbocker Trust Company. This was the third largest trust in all of New York City.
A massive institution. And its respected president, a man named Charles T. Barney, was linked, even if it was loosely, to Heinz's failed copper syndicate.
And that was enough, just the association.
That was all it took. On October 21st, 1907, the run on the Knickerbocker began. This is the moment the pressure truly broke the dam.
The numbers of that run are staggering, and they really illustrate the speed of the system's failure. Knickerbocker was forced to suspend operations the very next day, on October 22, 1907.
After paying out a shocking $8 million in hard cash.
In just a few hours.
In a matter of hours. $8 million in 1907 money. And because it was a trust company with those tiny reserves we talked about, they had no defense. They just ran out of cash.
And Knickerbocker's failure was basically a death sentence for confidence in the entire trust system.
Of course. Depositors at every other trust in the city looked at what happened and thought, if they can fall, so can my bank.
The panic was now an inferno. And this is where J.P. Morgan has to step in, because there is no other authority that can coordinate a response.
None whatsoever. By October 24th, 1907, just 2 days after Knickerbocker collapsed, credit had completely dried up. The New York Stock Exchange itself was on the verge of closing early.
Which would have been the ultimate signal of total economic collapse.
Total collapse. Yeah. So Morgan had to organize a multi-million-dollar pool of funds from the strongest national banks just to provide enough temporary liquidity to keep the stock exchange functioning through the afternoon.
He was already acting as the de facto central bank. He was trying to stabilize the system with private capital.
Right. And this bought the system a few days. But the core issue, the terrifying loss of confidence in all the remaining trusts, that was a ticking time bomb.
It sounds like the system was being saved by a series of desperate band-aids, but by the start of November, the bandages were peeling off. Morgan realizes he can't just save the stock market. He has to save the trusts themselves. Otherwise, the contagion is inevitable.
That realization is what leads directly to the meeting on that Saturday night. The system had only hours left before it failed entirely.
Okay, this is where we move from systemic failure to pure human drama. By the evening of Saturday, November 7, 1907, the financial system was hanging by a single fraying thread. The fear was acute because Monday morning, November 4th, was just hours away.
And J.P. Morgan, now 70 years old and reportedly suffering from a severe cold, he didn't call Washington. He didn't call President Roosevelt. He summoned the presidents of the remaining major trust companies, the men who held the keys to the city's remaining credit, to his private residence.
The location here is so critical for setting the scene. This was not some sterile bank boardroom downtown. It was the East Room of J.P. Morgan's private library at Madison Avenue and 36th Street.
Imagine the contrast for these bankers as they arrive.
Yeah.
Outside the city's gripped by fear, you have mobs of people outside banks, economic chaos everywhere.
And then they walk into this marble fortress of quiet, immense wealth.
Exactly. The East Room itself was a monument to Morgan's opulence. We're talking priceless manuscripts under glass, Renaissance art on the walls, magnificent tapestries. It was a room designed to impress and to intimidate.
The perfect stage for a power play. And Morgan wasn't alone. He was accompanied by his key financial allies men like James Stillman of National City Bank and George F. Baker of First National Bank. He had his lieutenants with him.
He did. And they were preparing to deliver an ultimatum, not to negotiate terms.
That's the crucial distinction, right? He gathered them around 10 o'clock at night. The purpose was survival, but Morgan's methods were dictatorial.
Absolutely. The demand was simple, yet financially excruciating for these bankers. They must immediately sign a legally binding document committing their institutions to a rescue pool of $25 million.
$25 million to save the weakest, most vulnerable trusts.
The very ones they blamed for the crisis?
But the resistance was fierce. I mean, these men were bitter rivals, they distrusted Morgan, and they certainly distrusted the reckless trust that had gotten them into this mess.
Their resistance was completely logical from a business standpoint. They argued for hours, deeply troubled. They kept asking, why should our sound companies, which have maintained high reserves, risk our depositors' money to save our reckless competitors?
It's a fair question. They felt they were being asked to betray their own shareholders and the people who trusted them.
They did. It was a debate between short-term fiduciary responsibility to their own company and long-term systemic stability for everyone.
And the bankers are, of course, focused on their individual institutions. Morgan is focused on the entire structure.
Exactly. And Morgan was not a patient man, especially not when the entire system was running out of time. Historians describe him growing visibly frustrated by the circular arguments, the finger-pointing, and what he saw as the paralyzing self-interest of these men.
And this leads us to the moment that gives this story its legendary status: the gilded cage.
Yes. Accounts detail how, sometime after midnight, tired of the endless back and forth and the constant delays, Morgan gave a quiet, almost imperceptible order to a guard. A guard who was positioned near the massive, ornate bronze doors of the East Room.
And the action was immediate. A heavy, resounding click.
That's it. The lock on the doors was turned. The bankers were trapped inside the library. They were prisoners in the ultimate fortress of wealth.
And Morgan had the only key.
He held the only key. He refused to let them leave until they signed the document committing the money. This act of physical coercion was just astonishing. It changed the entire dynamic from a financial negotiation to a brutal 7-hour test of endurance and submission.
Can you just imagine the atmosphere in that room? The panic raging outside, the marble silence inside, the thick cigar smoke filling the air, and the sheer gravity of what was happening. We're talking 2 a.m., then 3 a.m. The system is just hours from complete collapse, and these men are being held hostage by a 70-year-old titan.
And remember, the New York Stock Exchange was already down nearly 50% from its peak value. Every minute that ticked by increased the likelihood that the lack of confidence would cascade into utter ruin on Monday morning.
And Morgan tightens the psychological screws even further. Accounts detail his calculated, almost arrogant indifference. He didn't even participate in their frantic debate.
No, he retreated to a side room. Or sometimes he just sat calmly in the corner of the East Room, playing game after game of solitaire.
Solitaire.
Can you imagine? It was a masterful performance of psychological warfare. He was communicating without saying a word that time was on his side, that their freedom and the survival of their institutions depended entirely on their capitulation. He just let the pressure of the approaching Monday morning break them down.
So the bankers, they're terrified, they're physically and mentally exhausted, but they continue their debate. They were convinced they were doing the right thing by refusing to risk their depositors' funds.
And Morgan was convinced that their refusal would cause the collective ruin of the United States.
And had they succeeded in refusing, if they'd held out and walked out of that room unsigned?
The sources all agree. Monday, November 4th, 1907, would have been absolute unmitigated financial destruction. The modern history of the U.S. would have been radically different.
But wait, this act of locking up the nation's most powerful financial figures, forcing them to sign away millions under duress, was this even legal? Was there any challenge to his authority, or did they just accept that he was the law in that room?
They absolutely accepted his authority, not because he had a legal mandate, he had none, but because he held all the power and he had the only solution. Legality was basically suspended by the urgency of systemic collapse.
So he wasn't acting as a government official.
No, he was acting as a force of nature. His threat wasn't a legal one. It was a threat of social and professional annihilation come Monday morning.
Just before 4 a.m., the bankers were completely exhausted. The debate had been wrung dry, and Morgan re-entered the East Room with the drafted document.
The document committed the trust companies to that $25 million rescue pool. And Morgan didn't ask nicely. He demanded that the most senior trust president sign first to ensure the dominoes would fall.
The coercion, as historians like Gene Strauss note, was absolute.
It was. He told this senior man with chilling clarity that if he did not sign, he would be personally and professionally responsible for the ruin that would follow in just a few hours.
Yep.
He would be the man who let America fail.
That is the ultimate threat. It forces a choice between your individual virtue, protecting your company, and collective survival.
And in the face of that threat, resistance just collapsed. One by one, the bankers capitulated, signing away their millions. They weren't persuaded by logic in the end. They were just crushed by the iron will of J.P. Morgan.
And the time marker is so hauntingly precise. The final signature was affixed at 4:45 a.m. on Sunday, November 3rd, 1907.
The agreement was secured. The key was finally turned back in the lock, and the financially imprisoned leaders were allowed to stumble out into the pre-dawn hours of Sunday morning.
Just hours before the global markets would have reopened to absolute disaster.
The collapse had been stopped by sheer force.
So, as those exhausted trust presidents dispersed, carrying the heavy knowledge of what they had just been forced to do, the financial world received a sudden, unexpected reprieve.
The news of this secret all-night meeting and the confirmed $25 million rescue fund spread like wildfire throughout Sunday. And on Monday morning, the city held its breath. But the crisis began to immediately recede.
It's important to stress that the $25 million fund, while a lot of money, wasn't necessarily a massive injection of liquidity on its own. It was a powerful symbol.
It was a declaration of unity and intent.
Yeah.
The fund told the markets and the public one simple thing: the line will be held. The most powerful financial figures in America, organized by Morgan, were now unified.
And that psychological assurance was enough to halt the panicked runs. It allowed the NYSE to find its footing and for confidence to start trickling back into the system. We should clarify again the misconception that Morgan funded this all himself. His true power was organizational, right?
Absolutely. Morgan himself put up only a fraction of the funds. His power lay in his ability to command the capital of his peers, to force the strong to save the weak for the greater good of the system.
And we should also acknowledge the role of the U.S. Treasury Secretary George B. Cortelyou. He was also involved.
He was. He deposited federal funds into New York banks, which provided crucial, though temporary, government-backed liquidity. But Morgan was the necessary coordinator of the private response. He was the general on the field.
So the immediate crisis was averted, but the national reckoning had just begun. The stability of the entire economy had rested literally on one single, unelected private citizen playing solitaire in a locked room.
And that realization was terrifying for Washington. Lawmakers across the political spectrum, progressives, conservatives, everyone viewed this reliance on a single man as an unacceptable, profound national security risk.
What if Morgan had been sick that week? What if he died a year before the panic? The fragility of the whole thing was exposed for everyone to see.
And the emotional weight of the panic was driven home by the human tragedy as well. Charles T. Barney, the former president of the failed Knickerbocker Trust.
The first domino.
Yes, he committed suicide on November 14, 1907. It was a grim postscript that reminded everyone of the immensity of the pressure and the real destruction the panic caused.
And we shouldn't forget the real-world economic pain that followed, even with the successful bailout. The volatility translated directly into lost jobs.
It did. Unemployment, which had been under 3%, spiked to 8%. Banks had been saved. But the damage to industry and livelihoods was severe and immediate.
So the status quo was just violently broken. This forced ad hoc private solution created an unstoppable political momentum for systemic change. It's hard to imagine a more direct causal link in history than the one between the locked East Room and the creation of the Federal Reserve.
It is the ultimate hinge point. The library lock-in exposed the fatal need for a systemic institutional safety net, a mechanism that could inject liquidity and police the trust companies without relying on a financial autocrat.
This realization spurred immediate congressional action. The very next year, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908.
Which was a temporary measure. It allowed banks to issue emergency currency during a panic. That was the political Band-Aid.
But more importantly, the act also created the National Monetary Commission.
And this commission, led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, was tasked with investigating the failures of 1907 and proposing a permanent solution. The commission members traveled the globe, studying the central banking systems in Europe. This was the intellectual engine of the whole reform effort.
And their work culminated in one of the most secretive and pivotal meetings in American financial history, the gathering at Jekyll Island, Georgia.
Yes. In 1910, a small, highly secretive group of top bankers and political figures, including Aldrich himself, A. Piet Andrew, and powerful banking figures like Frank Vanderlip, they met secretly at the private Jekyll Island Club.
And they were essentially drafting the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve.
They were, and they kept it secret because they knew the public and Congress were deeply anti-Wall Street. They were suspicious of any plan drafted by a bunch of New York financiers.
They understood that the mere sight of bankers designing a national system would kill the legislation instantly. The fear of another J.P. Morgan, or what they called the money trust, dominated the political conversation.
And that public fear, fueled by the memory of the lock-in, led directly to the subsequent Pujo Committee hearings in 1912.
Okay, so what was that?
The Pujo Committee was a congressional investigation into the vast power of Wall Street, the money trust, and they specifically focused on Morgan's actions during the 1907 crisis. These hearings made it politically unavoidable to reform the system.
And the outcome of this entire chain reaction, the panic, the lock-in, the Jekyll Island meeting, the Pujo hearings, was the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913.
The irony is absolutely profound. The central bank, which stands today as the ultimate symbol of institutional financial stability and oversight,
Was conceived because a single, unelected private citizen had to physically coerce his rivals to save the nation.
Exactly. The government realized it couldn't trust the markets to police themselves, and it certainly couldn't risk relying on the whims of one old man.
The ghost of the lock-in became the architect of its own replacement.
It did. The Federal Reserve was born out of a desire to ensure that never again would the fate of the American economy rest on J.P. Morgan's personal charisma or his key ring.
So when we look back at the events of that single night in November 1907, we are forced to confront the immense fragility of the systems we often take for granted.
We really are.
So let's fully engage in the counterfactual analysis here. We need to internalize the magnitude of that near miss. What would the world have looked like if Morgan had failed? Let's say he played solitaire until 4 a.m., but the bankers still refused, walked out, and the markets opened unsigned on that Monday morning.
The result would have been instant and total collapse. The news that the most powerful financiers in New York could not agree on a rescue plan would have guaranteed widespread insolvency. Runs on banks wouldn't just be localized, they would be universal. Credit would simply cease to exist.
We often equate this with the Great Depression of the 1930s, but you're saying it would have been far worse and far more sudden.
Much, much worse. Remember, in 1907, there was no FDIC to ensure bark deposits, no safety net.
No unemployment insurance, no real social programs.
Nothing. And the rigid adherence to the gold standard meant deflation would have spiraled completely out of control. It would have been the Great Depression arriving 2 decades early with a complete absence of government structure to handle the crisis. The U.S. economy would have effectively stopped overnight.
So the conclusion, as you said earlier, it's inescapable. The difference between a total civil collapse in the world we currently live in was the turn of a key, a locked door, and the sheer iron will of one man.
Morgan wasn't just saving a few trust companies that night. He was saving the entire concept of American creditworthiness and market functionality.
And his actions were driven by a sense of duty to the system.
They were. But the underlying reality is that the stability itself relied entirely on him showing up, being healthy, and being willing to commit an act of coercion against his rivals.
It's astonishing that such immense power resided in a single personality. We often focus on the mechanics of financial collapse, but this story emphasizes the human element, the character and resolve of one individual overriding a complete systemic failure.
And that fragility thesis is where the modern relevance of this story truly hits home for you, the listener. The Federal Reserve, the FDIC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, all of these institutions are monuments to a near miss.
They are fire codes written after the near disaster was averted by brute force.
They are the system designed to replace the man.
Exactly. Every time the Federal Reserve acts as the lender of last resort, every time it opens the spigot to inject liquidity into a nervous market.
It is performing the institutionalized function that Morgan performed in that library. It is acting as the ghost of J.P. Morgan.
And the beauty of the institution is that it removes that personal element. We don't have to worry about the health or the mood of a single 70-year-old titan.
Well, that's the theory. But the ultimate insight of the lock-in is that we place immense faith in our systems and our laws. We believe the market will correct or that policies will hold. But history shows that at critical turning points, at moments of maximal fear, when the rules break down, the entire reality can hinge on the character, the health, or the determined resolve of a single human being in a single room.
The system failed. What saved us was coercion enforced by a man playing a game of cards. That should be a sobering thought for any modern society that prides itself on rules, democracy, and predictability.
It reveals the deep unpredictability in our history. The fact that a decision of such global consequence was reached because a group of bankers was held against their will, exhausted into submission, is a chilling reminder of how close we always are to the abyss.
That 7-hour test of endurance defined the next century of American monetary policy.
So let's synthesize the journey we took today. We saw a financial panic driven by deregulation and a rigid currency supply. The immense rising water of systemic weakness.
The crack in the dam was the locked door in J.P. Morgan's library, where he forced the surrender of the nation's financial leaders at 4:45 in the morning on November 3rd, 1907.
And the resulting flood of consequences was that terrifying national realization that stability depended on one man, which directly spurred congressional action, leading to the creation of the institutional safety net we rely on today, the Federal Reserve in 1913.
The library lock-in reveals the profound fragility of our economic reality. Our systems are not inevitable. They are built upon the memories and the avoidance of catastrophe. They are monuments to a near miss that hinged on a hair's breadth and the turning of a key.
It forces us to ask, what other invisible hinges is our world turning on right now? What current systems or institutions are depending entirely on the character or the presence of a single, powerful individual to hold the line against collapse, simply because the rules are inadequate to handle the real pressure?
That is a powerful and uncomfortable thought to mull over when you consider the foundation of your own financial security. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the moment J.P. Morgan held the American financial system hostage and, in doing so, created the future.
We encourage you to reflect on the nature of these pivotal turning points in history. We'll see you next time.